collect antique needlework? I have some wonderful garments in my collection that have given me inspiration for new garments that I've made for my daughter and grandchildren. I have a passion for fancy bands. Joining lace and fabric is the backbone of heirloom sewing, and the fancy band is perfect for using your favorite laces. Marlis Bennett is here to share her wonderful pillow project that will showcase our machine embroidery. Join me and let's start sewing. And I want to welcome you to my sewing room today. This is one of the most beautiful pillows I have ever seen in my life. It has two different kinds of silk. One is a silk organza with almost a window pane effect woven into the silk organza. Then it's placed on a black silk dupioni background. The wonderful machine embroidery, these little pieces just fit. And that is a little bit of our trick that we're going to share with you today. Now let's just see exactly how that happens. You have to print out your machine embroidery pieces to begin to see, okay, how big does the circle need to be? And then you can figure that out. Now we're going to use the wash away basting thread Madeira technique here. You fold now the outside of the pillow is going to be a square. So I fold it in half. I have half of the circle and I trace the design. After tracing it, I'm going to stitch it with water-soluble basting thread. Then I'm going to cut out the center part, fold it back on itself to turn it right side out, and then I spray starch and press until it is bone dry. The spray starch dissolves the wash-away basting thread. Then I pull it open, and I have a perfectly finished center section. And I'm going to then put it on the black background, but I've got to sew it down. So I use a machine decorative stitch of your choice to sew the ecru piece and the black piece together, and then it is time to start the machine embroidery. I'm so pleased to have as my guest today Marlis Bennett. Marlis is an educational consultant for Bernina of America. Marlis, welcome to the show, and thank you for making this beautiful pillow.
Well, thanks for having me. I think one of the biggest questions when I'm asked about the work that I do, and I do a lot with embroidery, is how do I get the placement just right? And that's what we're going to focus on today.
All right.
All right, most embroidery designs come with a template. It's either already printed in the package, or if some designs you have to open up in your embroidery software. And when you open them up in your embroidery software, you can print a template, which is what I've done here. Now, this is the original size of the design, and here's a round ruler. Now, these are really great tools to have in your sewing room because you can place the design behind the ruler and you can tell exactly how many inches from a center mark this design has to be to create a circular design. So it's a real quick, easy way to do that if you don't have embroidery software. If you have embroidery software, you can print out the design and then get your circle that way because you can create that circle in the design also. This is what I made a smaller one for today's purposes so that we have the small design printed out, and it shows me the placement of where the designs need to go. Then I have my big piece right here with the decorative stitches. Well, let's work on the placement of these designs. This is all well and good. It's when we get it to the fabric that we seem to have problems getting it in the right spot. So what I've done is I have trimmed around the outside edge of those designs with a pair of scissors. I still have my center mark of the design on the paper, on my template. And I have enough of them here for each of the designs that are on this circle. This way, by only embroidering one and then removing the template, I can, if I need to make any adjustments for the next embroidery, I can do that.
Okay, okay.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
So, then it becomes time, okay, I've got the first one embroidered. I need to embroider the one adjacent to it, whether it's the one here or the one right here. It needs to be the next one adjacent to it. Make sure I place my fabric onto some stabilizer. And here's a little trick. I'm going to take my hoop and open it up so that I'm ready to do the hooping. use my template that comes with every embroidery machine and place the template on top of the sandwich that I've just created. And then put the hoop into place. Okay, make sure your hoop's nicely opened. Okay, it should just slide right in there. But I've probably got one of the other pins in the way. There we go. I have everything in where it needs to be. Tighten the hoop. Now what you want is the center mark for your embroidery design to be in the center of that hoop. That way, when it comes time to place this on the machine,
You just slip that little template out.
make sure the template's out, get everything onto the machine, and then you can, I've got my needle center. I still leave the template on here, and then I just come over and I'm going to move everything into position so that everything lines up over the center mark, and adjust things if I have to. This way, when it comes time to embroider, I just remove the template and begin the embroidery process, and I'm ready to go. This ensures that all of your circles going, or your designs going around the circle, are going to be where they need to be.
That is fascinating, and that perfection of placement, really, this beautiful pillow is perfectly placed, and I really love your ideas for perfecting that placement.
Thank you.
Marlis, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And now Marlis has some sewing inspirations to share with you. Marlis, I love this, what I call a bridge cloth. I know it's a luncheon cloth, but my mother-in-law always called them bridge cloths. This is beautiful. Tell us what you did.
Well, it's a purchase tablecloth, and it was white when I started out. And we'll get to that in a moment. First, I used my placement technique to get the embroidered designs in the center and then around the edges of the tablecloth. Once you have everything embroidered, stick it in your favorite dye bath, whether it's tea or coffee, and then it not only ages the tablecloth, but it also ages your embroidery design.
It ages the whole thing. I love it. I love it. These are the cutest jeans.
Those are a really fun design. The only thing is there are about 17 color changes in each one of those roses. Placement is critical here. The other thing I did, and this is really important, is on my machine I have the feature where I can take the density of my embroidery designs down. So I stitch these out at about 65% of their original density.
On jeans, don't you?
Well, I didn't want boards. I wanted my leg to still be able to bend.
You want your leg to be able to move, okay. And this is a beautiful wall hanging.
Once again, now
contemporary.
It's very contemporary. It's little pieces of fabric placed on top of a background, and then some couching and lots of beadwork. The embroidery on here is this tree, and there's another tree over in this area. And this one here, these were all embroidered with silk embroidery thread.
Well, I love it. And I think placement is real critical when you're talking about a wonderfully tailored purchased vest such as this one, isn't it?
Right, and that's it's an embroidery design that creates tassels right here, and it's across the back and down each side of the front.
Oh, my favorite jacket.
Well, actually, this started out as a purchase blouse.
Oh,
and it was
okay.
very long, so I cut it off at the bottom and used some machine stitches to do the scalloped hem. And then this started out as a challenge. I ended up with a lot of 6-inch strips of silk ribbon, of the French embroidered ribbons. And I wanted to use a creative way to, or find a creative way to use those. This is the cuff off of the shirt when I shortened the sleeves. And then I enhanced all of it with embroidery. There's embroidery right here, and it makes little tassel embroideries. There's one up on the shoulder. And also on the front, there's quite a few embroideries. They just don't show up very much because they're all in the same color family as the ribbons that are on the blouse.
So you took your scraps and a store-bought blouse and made this wonderful, wonderful jacket. And the beautiful, this absolutely beautiful netting skirt. You did all of the lace, didn't you?
Right. I made the, well, actually the bottom
the
is
lace on the bottom. Let me just hold this up a little bit.
But this front cover, this is the English netting, and once again you have to use really good placement techniques to get the designs to come out perfectly along the bottom. Otherwise you'd have gaps.
Well, Marlis, thank you so much. And now Marlis has one more thing to share with you, a so quick, so easy project. Marlis, this is the cutest project. Show our viewers.
Well, thanks. This was really fun. You know, when people give me a gift or do something nice for me, I like to send a thank you note that's personal. And yes, I could go to the store and I could buy one very quickly, but that's not the point. You know, you need to put a little of something
Personal.
Yeah. You can get blank thank you notes at a lot of different craft stores. So I've used a little piece of fabric, a little bit of trim, 3 buttons, and I'm sure everybody has some buttons in their resource center. And
a la stash.
Yes, and then a little bit of my machine does have lettering on it, so I wrote the word thanks on it. And this way, when they open this up, they realize that I really did appreciate whatever it is. Okay, let's go through the steps needed to create this. Piece of fabric, I cut it down to that it's a 1/2 inch smaller than my card. And these cards usually come flat. I open them fold it in half, and then that way I can get my dimension. Once I have that, I adhere my fabric. Now, whether you use a temporary spray adhesive or you use a glue stick to adhere your fabric, that's okay. It's not going to hurt your machine either way. I then use a decorative stitch right here and sew around the 3 edges of my fabric. Don't have to worry about this one because I'm going to cover this with a trim. But before I cover it with a trim, I'm going to write the word thanks on paper. Now, this is really not hard to do. You need to know where you're going to position it. On most sewing machines today, you have the ability to use the lettering features, and they either have a combi mode or a memory system, and you combine those letters. I like to use a needle that is not too large for my thread, because the needle is going to make a rather large hole. So we start with a smaller thread. Oh, we got to bring up our feed dogs, and then things are going to work better. You'll notice that the machine just moves right through sewing the letters on paper.
That is pretty fascinating.
You're
just writing your thanks on the and greeting cards are expensive.
They're very expensive.
You know, $4 or $5 sometimes, and this is so much more personal.
It is. Okay, make sure it only sews it once. I think we stopped it a little too soon. But there is my lettering on here.
How pretty.
Then once I trim my threads, I would sew this down. Use a decorative stitch right in there, and then use your button sew on function on the machine and place your 3 buttons on here. Now, this didn't take very long.
And I would be willing to bet that your friend who receives that is probably going to keep it and maybe even frame it. I certainly would. Marlis, thank you so much for being here today. You've just had wonderful ideas for us.
Well, thanks.
And now I have some hand embroidery to share with you. I'm so happy to welcome as my guest today Wendy Schoen. Wendy has published over 30 patterns under the name of Petite Pochet. She has authored 4 books on hand embroidery. She has studied at the Royal School of London and in Madeira, Portugal. Wendy, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Martha. It's always great to be here. Today I have an interesting stitch. This stitch is the type of stitch that has a great showing but doesn't take a whole lot of work. It's called a raised stem. And this is where I want to point out where I use this stitch. And I use this stitch with a very lightweight pearl cotton just to give it a more textured look. It looks great when you mix it with a shiny thread and next to a shiny thread and add different types of stitches in it in your design. I'm going to move it over now so we can begin the stitch. Okay, let's start with a basic shape, and I'm going to be stitching this in a heavyweight pearl cotton so you can see what I'm doing. I normally wouldn't use this heavyweight thread in a design. I'm going to start with a waist knot, and as you know, a waist knot is a knot that you're just going to cut away after. And I'm going to begin by tying on inside the shape. Remember, we're going to stitch completely around this design so the tie-on stitches will not be visible. We're going to work a series of vertical bars or straight stitches from one edge of the design to the other. And we're going to space these bars out approximately 1/4 of an inch, but that will depend on how big your shape is. So you kind of have to look at it to see, okay, where do I need a bar and how far apart do they have to be? Once you do the design and the bars are too close, you can always go on the next shape. You can always make them a little bit farther apart. So this is about what they look like, and I'm going to continue on and fill the entire shape. So I'm going to go to the next hoop and I'll show you that step. Okay, so now my bars are completed, and I'm going to work across the bars instead of going through the fabric. So this is a stem stitch where you don't actually sew into the fabric. I'm going to begin at the center of the shape, which is across from point to point. I'm going to bring the thread out at the beginning of the point. Remember, a stem stitch is worked from left to right if you're right-handed and vice versa if you're left-handed. Bringing the needle under the first bar, and remember, not going through the fabric, slide it through. Tighten the stitch, but not too tight. The next bar, you want to do the same thing. Now, one thing I wanted to point out is when you make your bars, make sure you don't pull them very tightly, because then you won't be able to put your needle through. This stitch is going to be worked all the way across till we get to the end. As you can see, I'm not struggling with this at all. I'm just keeping my tension kind of on the tight side, but loose. And I'm trying to focus on keeping that first row down the center. Okay, so I'm going to get, when I get to the end now, I want to put the needle in at the point. Now, on this particular technique, we want the ends to be tapered. So we're going to use the edge of the design as our guideline for the placement of the next stitch. To work the next row, I'm just going to invert the hoop and rotate. And then I want to come out right beside that point, but not in the same hole, of course, because the stitch will just come right out. I'm going to hold the thread down again and work the next row. If you prefer to use a tapestry needle, that would probably work better, because you have a greater chance of splitting your thread if you use a pointed needle, as I'm doing right now. Anyway, a tapestry needle would be much better. And normally when I do this technique, the stitches are done with a much finer thread, and I want to make sure that I get as many rows in here as I possibly can, and so a tapestry needle will be much better for doing that. Now on the opposite end, remember, you have to bring it in at the point, but just a little bit past there, just like if you were doing satin stitching. Invert again and continue on. Come out just a little bit to the edge, leave a space, and we're going to work the next row. And you're going to get these stitches in there. Like I said, you're probably going to be able to get maybe 15 rows in here. All the way across. If you run out of thread, try to do so at the ends. Of course, you wouldn't want to run out of thread in the beginning of this stitch. I want to show you what it looks like when it's done. Here's a completed section. As you can see, these stitches are really packed in there. In fact, I probably could put another row or two. I just didn't want to push it here. But as you can see, it's a nice shape. It has a little bit of padding to it. You could actually put a row of padding first if you wanted it to be much more raised than it is. This is a great versatile stitch for adding a lot to your embroidery, and I don't think you'll have any problems doing it at all.
Well, it is so beautiful, and your bow on this basket cover, and actually, Wendy, I had never seen that stitch before, so I'm just really excited about seeing it.
You'd be surprised how many people ask me what that stitch is.
That's what I said, because I had never seen it. Thank you so much for sharing this with our viewers today.
My pleasure.
And now I have a beautiful doll christening dress to share with you. I have the world's most beautiful baby doll in my arms. Looks like a real baby, doesn't it? She even loves to suck her thumb. The dress, you might look at it and say, well, now that is so beautiful and it's so elaborate that would be very hard to make. I can assure you this is all beginning heirloom sewing, or beginning French sewing by machine. From the little high yoke on her dress, I'm going to pull her little thumb out so you can see the high yoke on her dress better. From the high yoke on her dress all the way down to the beautiful, very, very long skirt. Now, those of you that have been sewing with me for a long time know I love long skirts on christening dresses or dedication dresses or doll dresses. This skirt has a wonderful band around the bottom that we call a fancy band. It is beginning French sewing by machine. This whole dress is so easy to make. You just make it long and pretty and have the right fabrics and laces. Now, I'd like to share with you exactly what those laces are to make this beautiful, beautiful christening dress for a doll or a baby. The first thing that we're going to use is called French lace insertions, and the laces we use are totally French laces. The French lace insertion has two straight sides. This is a little ingredient called entredeaux. This comes from Switzerland, and it really looks like a railroad track for ants, and it means between the two. Entredeaux means between the two. This is called beading, and you sometimes run ribbon through the beading. Some you don't have to. It's another French lace, and this lace is called edging. It has a straight side and a scallop side. On the bottom of that beautiful fancy band, as you can see, was a ruffle, and I attached the ruffle to the bottom of the fabric using a technique called Martha's Magic. Now, what you have to do for Martha's Magic is to leave a little bit of fabric exposed. Now, I guess I've even left maybe not a scant quarter-inch of fabric exposed before I put the lace edging down. In other words, there's fabric sticking out on the side of the lace edging. All right, I'm going to do a wide zigzag. I think I have the zigzag on 3.5, and I have the length on short, maybe on half. And what happens is that little fabric rolls into the lace. If I put the lace on the very edge and zigzagged it, it would fall apart. That's the reason you have to leave that little edge of fabric exposed, and we've always, since the very first book that I wrote in 1983, we've always called that Martha's Magic. So the way that this lace was attached to the bottom of the fabric on the ruffle was the technique I just showed you. Now, here is what the fancy band is made of. First of all, it has entredeaux attaching to the top of the skirt. Now, I'm going to trim away the seam allowance of the entredeaux when I am butting it up to a finished French lace. So on this first piece, I will trim one side only because I'm going to need that seam allowance to put it to the fabric of the skirt. But I trim one side only, butt it up to the French lace, zigzag. Then next comes the beading. That will be butted up here and zigzagged. Insertion, beading, insertion, and once again I will trim away 1/2 of the seam allowance on this entredeaux because I'm going to attach it to the insertion. Now later on I will need, when I attach the ruffle, the fancy band to the skirt, I'm going to need that seam allowance. When I put it all together, it shrinks up, and because this is the fancy band, and now I'm ready to sew the fancy band to the skirt and then the fancy band to the ruffle. And now I would like to share a piece from my vintage collection with you. This beautiful little child's dress, I would estimate to be about a size 2, is what I know to be as Indian Ayrshire embroidery. Now, Ayrshire embroidery, which mostly came from Scotland, was very, very delicate stitching. This is the same idea as Ayrshire, except it's a lot heavier. You can see the little sleeves have a little Indian Ayrshire piece down the middle, and you can look at the beautiful work that is down the front. Very similar to the work from Scotland, except the embroidery is a lot heavier. You can see the beautiful little hem, which has drawn thread work on the hem, and there's a center panel, a side panel. Not in the very best shape in the world, but when I saw this in England, I absolutely had to bring it home because it's really one of the 2 pieces I've ever had that has the Indian Ayrshire. The buttons are all still on, which is pretty interesting for a dress that's been repaired as much as this one. One of the things I love to look at is the little repaired places. Here there were just little bitty tiny hand stitches to fix the little holes that had been repaired. I think it held up pretty well to be about 100 years old. That's one of the joys of collecting vintage pieces, is just sort of making up the stories that go along with it. Thank you so much for joining me in my sewing room today. I'd like to invite you to come back next time.